Okay, so first off, we started with anatomy, right? We went over the differences between your various types of blood vessels, arteries, veins, capillaries, right? What are the differences between those physically? And then we started to get into physiology. So when we're talking about physiology of the circulatory system, what we're really concentrated on is blood flow, right? How is blood flowing through your circulatory system? And so when we talked about blood flow, we said it was related to two things. What were those two things? Blood flow.
Vasoconstriction and vasodilation.
So sort of what you're describing there is resistance, right? So flow is inversely related to resistance. What that means is when resistance goes up, my flow goes down, right? So I have less blood flow in a constricted blood vessel than I do maybe a dilated blood vessel. And what else? What's actually driving the blood through your circulation? Yeah, pressure. Okay, we use this little equation. Use this little equation here, right? Flow is equal to pressure over resistance. What this means is the more pressure I have, the more flow I have. The more resistance I have, the less flow I have. Okay, but this doesn't really mean anything until we're talking about the entire body. When we're talking about the entire body, I can substitute these terms for some other ones, right? So when I'm talking about pressure in the entire body, in the entire circulatory system, what is my driving pressure in my entire circulatory system?
Audio output.
So cardiac output is my flow, which is good, right? Cardiac output is my flow. Okay? So when I'm talking about the entire circulatory system, however much cardiac output I have is how much blood flow I have, right? Whatever is leaving the heart, whatever is being put out from the heart, cardiac output, is my flow. Okay, but when I'm talking about pressure, what's the pressure I'm talking about? The mean arterial pressure. Right? So again, this mean arterial pressure is somewhere in between 120 and 80, but not quite right in the middle, around 93 millimeters of mercury, right? It's your average arterial pressure, which is driving blood throughout your entire circulatory system, right? You want to know this pressure because it's the pressure keeping you alive. It's the pressure pushing blood through your system. Okay, and then when I'm talking about resistance of my entire system, what do I now call my resistance? Peripheral resistance or systemic vascular resistance, either one. So we sort of started talking about this system. Okay, and when I rearrange this system, right, I can multiply my peripheral resistance to either side, and what I end up with is MAP equals cardiac output times peripheral resistance. And I can break these terms down, right? What is influencing my peripheral resistance? There's three factors that influence my resistance.
Viscosity with diameter.
The viscosity, which is N, this little N symbol. And how does viscosity affect my resistance? When I have more viscosity, does my resistance go up or down? It goes up, right? So it's directly related. What are the other two?
Length.
Length of the blood vessel, right? So put this up here as well. When my length of my blood vessel goes up, what happens to my resistance? It also goes up. They're also directly related. And then the last factor, the diameter, which we'll put as R to the 4th. When my diameter goes up, what happens to my resistance? When my diameter goes up, what happens to my resistance? It goes down, right? They're inversely related, so I put it under this bar here. These two really don't change much. Viscosity, maybe a little bit from day to day, but not really unless you're moving from Florida to the mountains. And the length of your blood vessels, the total length of your blood vessels doesn't really change once you become a full adult, right? Maybe as you go from a baby to an adult, it grows, but not really after that. This guy is the one that's changing the most, right? And it's also the most important as denoted by the power of 4. When I'm talking about cardiac output, how do I affect my cardiac output?
Heart rate.
Yeah, by changing my heart rate. And what other factor? Stroke volume. Your stroke volume. a little bit further. How do I calculate stroke volume?
EDV minus
EDV minus ESV. And what kind of things affect EDV and ESV? Preload. This one's particularly important for this chapter, and we'll talk about why. Preload is really defined as what?
Hypertension.
That's afterload. All right, so afterload over here.
Preload is the amount of blood that accumulates during ventricular contraction.
Yeah, right. How much blood do I have returning to the heart before ventricular contraction? So during relaxation. Okay, so how much blood is filling the heart? This is directly related to my blood volume. If I have more blood in total, my heart fills more. If I have less blood in total, my heart fills less. All right. Okay, and then afterload, and we talked about one more. Contractility. Again, you want to be able to do this by now. And this isn't just a fun way to show all the different things that can affect your mean arterial pressure. We are going to use this map as we go over the different factors or regulators of mean arterial pressure today. Okay. So, does anybody remember going through these first set of controls, right? We have short-term and long-term controls. We started with some of our short-term controls, right? Our neural control of our blood pressure. Anybody remember this? Yeah. And we're talking about baroreceptors here. So we'll start again because it seems like maybe not everyone remembers this exactly. So we'll start from this slide. Okay, so again, we want to control our blood pressure. We want our blood pressure high enough to go, drive our blood to the tissues so that our tissues can survive, getting enough oxygen and nutrients. But we don't want it too high where it's causing problems, making the heart work harder and all this sort of stuff. Okay, so again, we have two types of controls to regulate blood pressure. We have short-term controls and long-term controls. The short-term controls are good because they can happen very quickly, but they're bad because they don't last very long, right? They're short-term. Because they're short-term, they're sort of like a quick fix, right? They can sort of quickly fix our blood pressure, but over time, it's not going to be very useful. Our long-term renal regulation or long-term control is just the opposite, right? It kind of takes a longer time to kick in, but it's a much better fix because it lasts longer. Okay, so this is really the main difference. When we talk about short-term neural and hormonal controls, these are geared towards affecting things which can be controlled quickly, like your peripheral resistance and your cardiac output, right? If I can change my heart rate and the size of my blood vessels, I can change my blood pressure very quickly, right? Just by contracting and relaxing my blood vessels or increasing my heart rate. Long-term renal regulation is talking about altering blood volume, right? Altering blood volume is a much longer process. I actually have to, filter all this blood, find a toilet, urinate, get rid of some of this blood volume, okay? So we have these two controls, and we'll go over both of these in greater detail. So for neural controls of peripheral resistance, again, we're talking about altering our mean arterial pressure by altering our blood vessel diameter, right? This is pretty simple. I can either constrict or dilate my blood vessels. How can I do this? What part of the blood vessel allows me to do this? Yeah, the smooth muscle, the tunica media, right? I have this tunica media filled with smooth muscle. It can contract and relax. Okay, I also have the tunica externa feeding it with nerves from our, nervous system, and therefore I have neural control over this smooth muscle. Pretty simple. Now, what decides whether I'm contracting or relaxing this smooth muscle are these baroreceptors. Okay, these baroreceptors set up a feedback loop where they're sensing our blood pressure and acting on our blood vessel diameter. Right? Okay, so again, we have a feedback loop that involves the baroreceptors, which is our receptor here, the cardiovascular center of the medulla, this is our control center, and then the vasomotor fibers to the heart and vascular smooth muscle, this is going to be our output, right? Our two effectors being the heart and our vascular smooth muscle. Okay, so what happens? Well, the baroreceptor goes off, and it basically is sensing your pressure, right? Baroreceptor is a pressure sensor, basically. And so what happens is when you have high blood pressure, right, it's going to sense this and try to lower your blood pressure, right? It's pretty simple. So we have these baroreceptors located in the carotid sinus and the aortic arch, right? The aortic arch is obvious, right? This is our largest blood vessel, and therefore we want to know our blood pressure in it, right? This is going to be sort of directly related to your ventricular blood pressure. And then the carotid sinuses. These are blood vessels which carry blood to the head, right? You always want to make sure there's enough blood going to your head, to your brain, to keep you alive. Okay, so we have baroreceptors in these two locations. Increased blood pressure is going to stimulate the baroreceptors to increase input to the vasomotor center. And this is going to do two things. It's going to inhibit the vasomotor and cardioacceleratory centers. Okay, so we're slowing down our heart rate, or inhibiting our smooth muscle in our walls, our blood vessel walls, and then it's going to stimulate the cardio-inhibitory center. Okay, so this is again further decreasing our heart rate and decreasing our blood pressure. Okay. So what happens is we have a decrease in blood pressure due to three things: dilation of the arteries, dilation of the veins, and then decreased cardiac output in the form of decreased heart rate and decreased contractility. Okay. So let's look at this on one of these tables here, right? So here, my stimulus is high blood pressure. The baroreceptors are going to sense this high blood pressure, send this information to my control center, the brain, and the brain's going to have two outputs, right? It's going to slow down the heart, slow down or reduce contractility, both of which are going to reduce my cardiac output. Okay, so again, lowering my contractility, lowering my heart rate. Okay, if I lower my contractility, my ESV goes up, my stroke volume goes down, and therefore my cardiac output is going down. The other thing that the control center is going to do is going to tell the vasomotor center to relax these blood vessels. All right, so again, my radius of my blood vessels goes up, right? I'm relaxing, therefore there's a larger radius. How is that going to affect my peripheral resistance? Well, it goes down, and therefore you can see that when I have increased blood pressure as my stimulus, I end up decreasing my blood pressure as my result, right? As my effector, my response. Just the opposite is true here. If my stimulus is lowered blood pressure, then all of the opposite things are going to happen. Okay? The baroreceptors are inhibited, therefore the control center is no longer getting this signal. It's going to tell those vasomotor centers to kick back in, start constricting the blood vessels, and the heart rate to go up, contractility to go up, right? Cardiac output to go up. And we restore all this blood pressure. Does everybody see this process? Okay, again, it's important to note that whenever we're talking about one of these regulators of blood pressure, we're going to affect the entire system and not just one part. Okay? Especially when we're talking about short-term controls. When we talk about long-term controls, we're going to be only focusing on blood volume. Okay? But for these short-term controls, they're quick and effective, right? They're a quick fix. So I'm affecting all these different parts at once in order to bring my blood pressure up or down immediately.
Professor McClain, can you just go over the ESV again? The ESV is going up as we bring our cardiac output down.
No. Okay. So again, I'll go over this slowly. I had my coffee today, so I know I'm going a little fast. So our initial stimulus is a rise in blood pressure. Okay. This is our initial stimulus. This is an unwanted rise in blood pressure, or above a blood pressure that's normal. You have baroreceptors in your aorta and in your carotid sinuses, which are going to sense this increase in blood pressure and send that information to your brain. Your brain now has effectors, right? These fibers, which are going back to two places: the heart, and affecting cardiac output, and the blood vessels, and affecting your peripheral resistance. Okay. What it tells the heart to do is decrease the heart rate, right? Slow down the heart because the pressure is too high, and There's only one thing that the nervous system can affect, is contractility, right? Bring down your contractility. Stop pumping so much blood with every beat. When I bring down my contractility, I'm now pumping less blood, which means my ESV, or the volume left in my heart after I contract, goes up. If I'm subtracting by a larger number, my stroke volume is going to go down. And therefore, both of these things, right, are affected by the sympathetic nervous system. We're talking about neural controls again. Are going to bring my cardiac output down. Okay. Furthermore, it affects the vasomotor center, which is this guy right here, right? I can affect my peripheral resistance by affecting my diameter of my blood vessels. Again, you already said the tunica media has smooth muscle which can contract or relax. Here we're telling the smooth muscle to relax, right? Oops. When I'm relaxing, my diameter goes up, right? I'm opening up my blood vessels upon relaxation. Okay, so when my diameter goes up, my peripheral resistance goes down. And now we have three effects which are counteracting this rise in pressure. We have a decrease in cardiac output via heart rate and stroke volume, and we have a decrease in the resistance. Okay, this is going to bring your blood pressure back down. Does that make sense? Okay. Now we can do the opposite too. Okay, and you should be able to do the opposite as well. So now the situation is my mean arterial pressure is too low, and my baroreceptors sense this. I'm not getting enough blood flow to my brain, which is obviously a bad thing. Okay, so what are they going to do? Again, relay that information to the brain. The brain has two responses: one to the heart, one to the vasomotor center, okay, or the blood vessels. It's going to tell the heart rate to go back up. It's going to tell the contractility to go up. When my contractility goes up, my ESV goes down, and therefore my stroke volume goes up. And my heart rate and my stroke volume, of course, both affecting my cardiac output. It's going to tell my blood vessels not to relax this time, but to constrict, right? Increase your pressure to the brain, right? So my systemic blood vessels radius does not go up this time, but goes down, right? I'm constricting them, so my diameter gets smaller. This increases my peripheral resistance, and that initial drop in pressure is now reversed. Okay. Does everyone see this? Again, you wouldn't really be able to think this through in such a clean way unless you had this map. I think does it help? Or should I just erase it totally? Okay. Good. All right. So that's baroreceptors. We also have chemoreceptors. How fun. So we also have these chemoreceptors here. This time they're not sensing pressure like a baroreceptor, but they're sensing chemical composition. And really they're sensing pH, but that pH can be translated to a rise in carbon dioxide or a decrease in oxygen. Okay, we'll talk about how that happens later. Okay, so what happens here? When I sense too much carbon dioxide or too little oxygen, now I'm going to jack up my blood pressure, right? I'm going to send more blood to the lungs, right, to pick up oxygen. I'm going to send more blood to the tissues, right, because they're not getting enough. There's not enough oxygen in my normal blood flow. Okay, so the chemoreceptors are stimulated and cause increased blood pressure by the same two factors, right? Sending one signal to the heart, increasing cardiac output, and sending one signal to the blood vessels, right? Increasing your peripheral resistance. Okay, and so this is mapped out for you here, right? We actually add in this respiratory center stimulated. You won't have to know that for the exam though, because we're not at that chapter. But it's important to note that it does happen, right? It's not just the fact that you're increasing blood flow, but you're also increasing the amount of oxygen you're bringing to the blood. Right? This is why chemoreceptors do that, is because they're sensing such low oxygen. But the same other maps are here, right? The chemoreceptors are stimulated. That's going to stimulate the cardiocirculatory centers. This is going to increase your heart rate, increase your stroke volume, and it's going to stimulate your vasomotor centers, which decreases your radius, brings your peripheral resistance back up. all of this is going to increase your blood pressure and therefore get blood moving to two places, not just the systemic circuit, but also to the lungs to pick up oxygen. So we went over two different things, the baroreceptors, which are sensing pressure directly, and the chemoreceptors, which are sensing how much oxygen is there. Okay, so it's important to know this difference. Both of these things act in the same way, right? They both affect heart rate and stroke volume and peripheral resistance via blood vessel diameter. All right, do you guys want me to go over this one? Like on the map? Yes, I got one yes, I got two yeses, I got... Okay, so the chemoreceptors this time, these are sensing, low oxygen. Okay, this is the stimulus this time, low oxygen, not low pressure, but low oxygen. So if you have low oxygen, regardless of your pressure, you're going to increase your pressure, right? Just because you need, that's the whole point of blood, is getting oxygen to tissues. Okay, so when I have low oxygen, these chemoreceptors are going to send two signals. Again, one to the heart, telling my heart rate to speed up, and my contractility to go up. My contractility goes up, ESV goes down, stroke volume goes up. Okay? Both of these things increasing my cardiac output. Also, it sends a signal to the blood vessels, right? It's telling the blood vessels, again, to constrict, and therefore my radius goes down, or my diameter goes down, and my peripheral resistance goes up. All of these three things increasing my mean arterial pressure. This mean arterial pressure, again, driving your blood to two places, the lungs to pick up oxygen, and then out to the tissues to deliver that oxygen.
I got a question. Where the blood vessel symbol is there under R, what is that symbol, a line and a symbol?
Oh, that's just me emphasizing it a lot. Okay. Doesn't mean anything, actually. All right. So, any questions about this stuff? Neural controls. We can continue on with these different controls. Hormonal controls have sort of two different pathways. One is this short-term regulation, and then one is long-term regulation. We'll finish up with short-term regulation by these different hormones here, right? Epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline and noradrenaline, are going to cause increased cardiac output, and vasoconstriction. These are both going to increase blood pressure. We also have angiotensin II and ADH. These are directly related. Okay, the more angiotensin II I have, the more ADH I release as well. These are going to stimulate vasoconstriction, both of these, right? Angiotensin II initially, and then really high ADH levels also stimulates vasoconstriction. All three of these hormones are involved in increasing blood pressure short term, right? As long as I release these hormones, then I'm going to vasoconstrict and therefore increase blood pressure. I can cause lowered blood pressure with this hormone, atrial natriuretic peptide. Has anybody heard of this? We didn't talk about it in the heart chapter, ANP? Okay, well, okay, atrial natriuretic peptide is going to cause lowered blood pressure, but this time it's a long-term control. It's going to cause lowered blood pressure by decreasing our blood volume or increasing our urine output. Okay? So here's some short-term mechanisms. Here's where we lead into a long-term mechanism. Okay. Now, we'll get into the long-term mechanisms. Again, baroreceptors are really quick adapters. They're phasic adapters, meaning that they quickly adjust to stimuli. This means if you have a chronic low blood pressure or chronic high blood pressure, those baroreceptors will eventually become ineffective or stop working. Okay, so when the baroreceptors stop working and you still have high or low blood pressure, now what happens? Now you need long-term mechanisms to control your blood pressure. Again, I said these short-term mechanisms like the baroreceptor, the chemoreceptor, these were sort of quick fixes. They might adjust your blood pressure initially, but it's not going to last for a very long time, right? The long-term mechanisms, after these short-term mechanisms give out, the long-term mechanisms kick in and sort of fix the problem for a long time. Okay, so long-term mechanisms control your blood volume. Okay, so what we're talking about is now changing your blood volume to ultimately alter your blood pressure. Okay, this is done via the kidneys. Again, we talked about what the kidneys do. What do?
They send out a signal to produce produce more blood?
They can do that, but yeah, that's one of their functions for sure. But in general, what's the function? It's filtration,
Filter.
right? They act as a filter. But what are they filtering? They're filtering your blood and making what out of it? Urine, right? So when I have increased urine output, I'm taking that fluid away from the blood. The more urine I produce, the less blood I have, right? You're actually urinating part of your blood, okay? So if I tell my kidneys to stop making urine, then I'm saving blood volume and therefore increasing my pressure. When I tell my kidneys to produce more urine, now I'm losing blood volume and therefore losing blood pressure. Right? I know you probably don't think about it. I never thought about it that way, but that's how they're all connected, right? So the kidneys do this in two ways: a direct renal mechanism and an indirect renal mechanism. The direct one's fairly easy, and so we'll go over this one first. Okay, direct renal mechanism alters the blood volume independently of any hormones. And it's fairly simple. When I have increased blood pressure or blood volume, this is going to cause increased pressure at the kidneys as well, right? The kidneys are fed by arteries. They have capillaries there, so an increase in blood pressure is obviously going to increase blood pressure at the kidneys as well. Well, that increase in pressure is causing more urine formation. Right? The higher my pressure at the kidneys, the more blood is being pushed out through the filter and becoming urine, right? It's that simple. So again, increased blood pressure causes elimination of more urine, therefore reducing blood pressure. Decreased blood pressure causes kidneys to conserve water, right? And therefore saving more water in the blood volume, increasing the blood volume, and increasing your blood pressure.
So people with high blood pressure tend to urinate more? than
Yes.
people- Really?
Yeah. If they're
Does-
drinking water.
Could it, okay, 'cause I was gonna say sometimes could it be that the body's retaining it in edema and they're not getting rid of it?
We'll talk about this next part here. So in general, if you have higher blood pressure or you have things that are in the blood which cause more osmotic pull, so for example, diabetics pee more often because they end up with glucose in their kidney tubules, and that's acts as an osmotic agent. So it's actually pulling water into the urine and causing more urine to be formed instead of keeping it as blood. Okay, so anything that causes you to pee more is going to lower your blood pressure. Anything that causes you to urinate less is going to increase your blood pressure. Okay, so this is the direct renal mechanism, and it's fairly easy. The indirect renal mechanism is known as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. That's because it's a series of hormones that act on each other, okay? So what happens here, instead of having this direct, blood pressure increases urine output, which decreases blood volume, which decreases blood pressure, here is a lot more indirect, right? It's a lot more roundabout way of doing the same thing. When I have a decrease in arterial blood pressure, the kidneys release this hormone called renin. Now that renin is going to enter the blood and convert angiotensin 1, which is already there, angiotensinogen, which is already there, into angiotensin 1. Okay, and then angiotensin 1 is converted by angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, into angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is your active angiotensin. This angiotensin is going to cause a rise in ADH, a rise in aldosterone, and some other effects as well. It increases the thirst via the hypothalamus, okay? And also increases vasoconstriction and increasing peripheral resistance. Okay, so we have a lot of things going on here. You can see, if we follow this map, a decrease in arterial pressure causes the release of renin from the kidneys. The renin is going to start this process, right? Angiotensinogen converted to angiotensin 1, which is immediately converted to angiotensin 2 by ACE. Angiotensin 2 then releases more aldosterone from the adrenal cortex, releases more ADH, right? And causes vasoconstriction. Okay, this is something we talked about earlier. So aldosterone is going to increase your sodium reabsorption and therefore increase water reabsorption. ADH also is going to cause water reabsorption by the kidneys. And vasoconstriction, of course, increasing your pressure. Right? So these first two things are going to cause an increase in blood volume. If I'm reabsorbing more water in my kidneys, then it's not becoming urine, so it's less urine output. And then this is going to directly cause higher pressure through peripheral resistance. Now the final thing it does is it tells your hypothalamus, part of the brain, that you're thirsty, right? It tells your brain to find water and drink it, okay? So not only is it saving blood, water, and blood volume, it's also looking for more blood volume from an outside source, okay? So it's pretty cool. The indirect renal mechanism is really obviously indirect, but it's multifaceted. It's a really good system to bring your mean arterial pressure back up. Okay, so just to recap, what does angiotensin do? It increases blood volume via three things: stimulates aldosterone secretion, causes ADH release. Both of these are going to tell your kidneys to save water or produce less urine. It also triggers the hypothalamic thirst center, so you become thirsty and you look for water from outside sources. Furthermore, it directly causes vasoconstriction, which is a short-term control. Remember we talked about how some hormones are involved in short-term controls. Well, we talked about this hormone already. Angiotensin 2 stimulates vasoconstriction. Okay, so we went over chemoreceptors, we went over baroreceptors. Now let's go over these two kidney mechanisms. Okay, so again, with the kidney we have two things. We have direct and indirect regulation. My direct is simple enough, right?
Yeah.
What it states is when my mean arterial pressure goes up, also the pressure to the kidneys goes up and I'm making more urine, which means my response is my blood volume goes down. If my blood volume goes down, my preload goes down, my EDV goes down, my stroke volume goes down, therefore my cardiac output goes down, and I reverse that pressure. All right, everyone sees this? Just the opposite is true as well, right? When my mean arterial pressure goes down, right, I have low blood pressure. Now my kidneys are receiving less pressure as well, therefore they produce less urine, and my blood volume goes up. I'm saving blood, I'm producing less urine. So my preload goes up, my EDV goes up, stroke volume up, cardiac output up, and I reverse that mean arterial pressure. Everyone sees this. This is the direct renal mechanism. My indirect renal mechanism is a little more convoluted. My indirect renal mechanism basically turns renin into angiotensin 2. Right, this is the end goal. I end up with this angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 does multiple things. It releases ADH and aldosterone. Okay, I don't expect you to know these things previously, but you can know that both of these things cause an increase in blood volume. Okay. And it's also going to vasoconstrict, right? So the radius of my blood vessel goes down. Okay. Furthermore, which is something we haven't even mapped out here, it sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which says, you're thirsty. Okay, this hypothalamus hopefully will trigger you to drink water, and therefore also brings your blood volume up. So if my blood volume goes up, my preload goes up, my EDV goes up, stroke volume up, cardiac output goes up, my radius goes down, my peripheral resistance goes up, and both of these things should restore my mean arterial pressure. Okay, you can see the direct mechanisms a little bit more direct than the indirect, but you should know both. Practice both at home or whatever. Any questions about that stuff? I feel it, okay. So this is mapped out for you here. This is the indirect renal mechanism. And then I have a side-by-side comparison, direct renal mechanism versus indirect renal mechanism. Some review. And all of it together.
It's gonna be on the test next week?
It's not next week. Is there a test next week?
Yeah, on the 27th.
So can you read it?
Yeah.
Well, get to the review then. What's that? Do you not understand this?
No, it's just it's a lot of information
Yeah,
to take.
for one
That's
week.
all. I guess I personally didn't do great on the first one, so I'm just I gotta
Especially since your lab
go home
is
and study it.
Yeah.
study for lab. It's still so
It's it's just our
Yeah, all right. I understand. There's lab, there's lecture, there's 2 different classes that have exams, but we have to have exams in both, so unfortunately that's true. Like I said, the easy. Yeah, well, I'll try and get to the review, that's what I was saying. We better get to the review before the exam. Like I said, the best way to remember the regulation of mean arterial pressure is this map, okay? We have 4 things that we talked about. Indirect and direct kidney mechanism, and then your neural controls, which was the baroreceptors and the chemoreceptors. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, it's really 4 different ways which you alter mean arterial pressure, and 4 different stimulus. This is monitoring pressure. This is monitoring oxygen levels or CO2 levels. This is also monitoring pressure and monitoring pressure. Okay, so I know it's a lot, or it seems like a lot at first, but when you start going home, you start doing this over and over again. Like I said, it doesn't take multiple hours to study this one concept. Just take 20 minutes at a time. Draw out your map. Tell me what happens when the pressure is too low with baroreceptors. Tell me what happens when the oxygen level is too low with chemoreceptors. Tell me what happens with the kidneys when the pressure is sustained, is sustained at a low level, or what happens via the indirect mechanism when the pressure is sustained at a very low level. Yeah.
So just those are the 4 things that I'm gonna memorize on that map.
Yeah, these are the only 4 things we talked about, right? So group it together, break it down. It's really not that bad. Yes.
What does that say under direct kidney? Right
Pressure. It's sensing pressure and doing. And the direct one's so easy that it's basically like 3.5, right?
Does that also say pressure under baroreceptors?
Yeah, baroreceptor pressure.
So the neural is short term and the kidney is long term. What makes your body want to do the long term versus short term?
Okay, so like I said, the short-term one is going to happen quick. This is good because you want to be able to adjust your blood pressure quickly. But over time, these baroreceptors will stop being sensitive to like a higher or low pressure. If you have a sustained high blood pressure or sustained low blood pressure, the baroreceptors just give out. They just say, okay, well, you can't change anything, obviously, so we're adapting to this new stimulus. This is our new pressure, our new normal pressure. That's when your long-term takes it. Now your kidneys are saying, okay, well, you're going to have a sustained high pressure, we're going to increase our urine output. And so we're going to reduce the blood volume, and that's going to fix the problem for a long time, or a longer time. Yeah.
So you said the baroreceptors, that's for the peripheral pressure, and then the chemoreceptors is the O2. That's what affects it, or causes it?
Yeah, this is what the stimuli are, right? So here the baroreceptor is sensing pressure, right? Either the pressure too high or too low. Here the chemoreceptors are sensing low oxygen. But they work the exact same way. They do the exact same thing. This stimulus is only different. So really it's like 2.5.
And the long term, they're both pressure?
Yeah, they're both pressure, right? One is a direct mechanism and one is an indirect mechanism, but they're both caused by low pressure or high pressure. No, these do 2 totally different things, right? This one's directly affecting blood volume. This one's indirectly affecting blood volume as well as peripheral resistance. These guys do the same thing. They affect the heart rate, contractility, and peripheral resistance, or vessel diameter, whatever you want to. Okay, I'll tell handwriting, but whatever. Okay, so you can really start to break it down, and it becomes to not be so bad. Okay, it looks like a lot when I have this map up here, but this is really to help you. Okay. So there was some questions when I asked for questions, it seems like. So we'll continue on. Or should we continue on? Can we continue on? All right. So that does it for the first half of this chapter. We'll move on to the second half, which is more physiology stuff, but admittedly a little bit more easy, right? A little bit more straightforward concept. Okay, so monitoring the circulatory efficiency. We talked about all the things that regulate the circulatory efficiency, but monitoring the circulatory efficiency is important too, right? Making sure that these things are working properly. So in order to do this, we check the vital signs, right, which are classically 4 vital signs, but I'm sure there's more now. Pulse, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and body temperature. Is there more?
Use SpO2, which would be your
Oxygen.
oxygen.
Oxygen, okay, yeah. So add in a few of your own, whatever. But these are going to be the ones on the exam, okay? So pulse is obviously directly related to our pressures. When we're talking about pulse, what we're really talking about is your pulse pressure, the difference between diastolic and systolic pressures as, you know, the heart beats and contracts and relaxes, okay? This causes a pressure wave, which expands and recoils the arteries, right? Or expands and contracts the arteries. And usually you can take this pressure at the wrist, right? Your radial pulse, right? So has anybody felt their radial pulse before? Now, you don't have to take it at the wrist, but there's also other pressure points. Basically, these pressure points are where the arteries are close enough to the body surface where you can actually feel that pulse pressure. Okay? So here you can see radial artery, brachial artery, common carotid, right? This is probably the easiest one for me to check. All these different places, right? If you press hard enough at these areas, you can actually stop blood. So measuring blood pressure, right? How do we measure the blood pressure if you can't actually get into the heart and set up your own barometer or baroreceptor, right? So in order to measure blood pressure, we use the sphygmomanometer, right? And what we do here is we basically blow up a cuff and cut off one of these pressure points. Once we cut off this pressure point or raise the pressure in the cuff above the pressure point, it closes off blood flow. Okay? Now, once we close off blood flow, we're going to slowly reduce the pressure in the cuff. And as the pressure in the cuff comes back down, you'll hear 2 things. You'll hear, 1, the start of some noise. These noises are known as sounds of Korotkov. And then 2, you'll hear the stop of those noises. And that's going to give you 2 measurements, okay? It's going to give you your systolic pressure and your diastolic pressure. Okay, the first thing you hear is the pressure at which, you know, blood starts to squirt back into the artery again, okay? Or it's no longer cut off. All right, this is your systolic pressure, normally around 120 millimeters of mercury. The reason you hear something is because you're sort of closing off this artery just enough to cause blood to flow erratically, right? Has anybody ever squeezed like a hose that's flowing, right? And you see that the water starts to come out harder and more diffusely, okay? The reason it does that is because you're sort of closing it off, right? And in the blood vessels, when you do that, that blood is going to hit the outside of your blood vessel wall, right? It's going to make this noise because it's spurting on the blood vessel wall. Okay, so you start to hear that as soon as the cuff goes below the systolic pressure. Now when the cuff goes below diastolic pressure, you are not closing off that blood vessel at all. It's like totally releasing the blood vessel. This is going to give you your diastolic pressure, or the pressure at during diastole, right? Which is normally less than 80 millimeters of mercury. Again, this is where the sound stops because blood flow is no longer erratic. It's no longer hitting the blood vessel wall, but it's flowing smoothly through this artery. So, what you're looking for when you measure blood pressure is maybe too high blood pressure or too low blood pressure, right? Hypertension is high blood pressure. Hypertension, right? Or tension that's more than normal. So hypertension is defined as a sustained elevated arterial pressure of 140 over 90 or higher. Okay, so this is pretty high. They can say that you might have pre-hypertension if you're nearing this range, but not quite at this range. And this pre-hypertension, is a good indicator that if some sort of lifestyle change doesn't occur, you'll eventually have hypertension. Okay. And hypertension, of course, is a bad thing, right? Hypertension just, not only does it increase afterload, right, which we talked about earlier, afterload is going to increase the amount of work that the heart must do, but also it accelerates arteriosclerosis, right? It aids in the buildup of plaque in the artery wall, okay? Again, if we increase the afterload, the heart must work harder to pump the same amount of blood, and when the heart works harder, it's not like your other muscles, it's not a muscle you want to grow. Basically, the myocardium gets larger and it weakens, right? The heart has a set number of blood vessels which feed it. Okay? If you have too large of a heart and not enough blood flow, the heart muscle actually weakens, right? And so instead of a large heart being a good thing, a large heart is a really bad thing.
Question.
Okay. So we have two types of hypertension. Primary hypertension is sort of the more common one. There's really no direct thing you can point to and say that's causing your hypertension. It's more just a variety of factors which contribute. Okay, this is because pressure can be influenced by a variety of factors. So there's really no cure, but it can be controlled, right, with changes in lifestyle, really. Reducing your fat intake, your salt intake, your cholesterol intake, increasing exercise, losing weight, stopping smoking, and maybe if none of that helps, antihypertensive drugs. Secondary hypertension is the less common form, but the good news is you can directly point to something and say this is causing hypertension and we can cure it. Okay, so it might be due to something like obstructed renal arteries or kidney disease, right? Again, kidney is super important in maintaining long-term pressure via blood volume, right? So if you obstruct your renal arteries, you're not able to control your blood volume. Okay. Also, endocrine disorders, right? Things that are causing the release of more or less endocrine hormones can cause secondary hypertension. Of course, whatever the problem is, you target that problem and you can cure it, right, or fix it.
Could you go back just one?
Sure.
Okay, so 90% of hypertensive conditions, okay,
So it's a more common one.
okay, equals primary hypertension.
Yeah, primary hypertension accounts for 90% of hypertensive conditions in America. Hypotension, on the other side, is low blood pressure, right? Hypo is lower than normal, like hypothermia, lower body temperature. Hypotension is lower blood pressure. And this is actually sort of desirable, right? It's defined as a blood pressure below 90/60, usually not a concern. It's actually a sign of, maybe you're going to live longer, or you have no cardiovascular illnesses, which is good. However, if it's too low, then of course blood's not flowing through your cardiovascular system, and that can be a problem.
So you're gonna give us like scenario questions next week where you say this person has like low blood pressure and they're hiking and.
No.
With it.
I will. These are definition questions. Whenever we get to the homeopathy stuff, it's usually what is hypertension, or low blood pressure is defined as whatever.
But you know that, you're gonna probably give us a scenario, right? I'm just trying to think ahead and make sure I can understand some of your scenarios.
So some of the scenarios will be, what happened, how does a baroreceptor in your carotid sinus senses low blood pressure, what happens to heart rate? Or what happens to contractility? Or what happens to blood vessel diameter? Or what happens in general to all three of those things, right? Situations. So some causes of hypertension, orthostatic hypotension, this is where you just get up out of bed maybe too quickly, and so your blood vessels don't have time to adjust, and so you have decreased blood flow to maybe your brain, and therefore it causes a little bit of dizziness. Chronic hypotension might be a sign of poor nutrition or some underlying disease like Addison's disease or hypothyroidism. And then acute hypotension, right? This might be due to some large amount of hemorrhaging, right? Some large blood loss, indicating circulatory shock. So we've talked about blood flow in general, and it's important to know how it's regulated. But now we're going to talk about blood flow to individual areas. Okay. So in this particular instance, we're talking about blood flow through the body tissues. Okay. This is really one of the more important jobs of the systemic circulation is to obviously bring oxygen and nutrients to the tissues and pull waste and carbon dioxide away. Right. So tissue perfusion is involved in all these things: nutrients, delivery of oxygen and nutrients, pulling waste away from the cells, and even urine formation when we're talking about the kidneys. So tissue perfusion, when we talk about controlling blood flow to these specific areas, we're not talking about this anymore, right? Now we're talking about opening or closing muscular arteries, opening or closing capillary sphincters to allow more or less blood into a specific area. Okay? So this is really a nice overview, right? Here you're looking at total blood flow at rest versus someone who's maybe exercising, and you can see some of the differences, right? To the muscles, like skeletal muscles and the heart, you can see that during exercise we have increased blood flow, right? Sort of 10 times as much in skeletal muscles and 3 times as much in the heart. Okay. Also, we have increased blood flow to the skin, right? Why might that be? Sweating, right? And you're trying to lose this body heat, so instead of keeping, this blood, which has a lot of your heat in it, in the internal organs, you're going to put it out towards the skin where we can actually lose some of that body heat. Now, blood flow to the kidneys, to the abdomen, you can see decreases. Why might that be? Well, yeah, that's part of it, right? Blood flow to the kidneys decreases because you want to preserve water and basically increase the volume going other places. But why the abdomen then as well? The digestive tract.
Necessity.
That would be the ANS system that kicks in, right?
Right, so during exercise, basically you're in fight or flight mode, right? Fight or flight mode says you're going to increase blood flow to the skin, to the muscles, to the heart, decrease blood flow to your digestive system, to your urinary system, right? So the reason why you have decreased flow to the kidneys and abdomen is, again, if you're running away from a saber-toothed tiger, you don't want to stop and pee or poop, right? So this is for one of those reasons. Finally, you can see blood flow to the brain does not change whether you're exercising or not. Okay, why might that be? Right, you always want blood going to your brain, right? You're not using your brain any more when you're exercising than when you're not, or maybe a little bit more. But you always have a consistent flow to your brain. You're never going to want blood flow to be less towards your brain. Okay, so we'll go over all of these differences individually. Okay, so before we do that, the velocity of blood flow is important. It's important to note that the velocity of blood flow is inversely related to the total cross-sectional area, okay, of these blood vessels. Okay, what this means is it's fastest in the aorta and slowest in the capillaries, and then picks back up in the veins. Also, when I have my true capillaries shut, I have way less total cross-sectional area, and therefore blood is shunting or flowing through my capillary bed much faster than if I have all those true capillaries open, right? Those precapillary sphincters. Okay, so when we open up those true capillaries, that very, very slow capillary flow is going to allow adequate time for exchange, right? Again, capillary beds are where you get exchange of materials. You have gases, nutrients coming in, leaving the blood and entering the tissues, and then you're picking up waste and carbon dioxide. Okay, so this is what that looks like, right? Here you can see a graph showing you the total cross-sectional area of a vascular bed, right? And all these different vascular beds, aorta, all the arteries, the arterioles, and the capillaries, right? You can see the total cross-sectional area is highest in the capillaries. And when we compare it to this other graph, the velocity, you can see that it's slowest in the capillaries, almost directly related, again, to the cross-sectional area. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, when we're talking about controlling flow during exercise, A lot of what's going on is known as autoregulation. Okay, basically we're going to open up blood vessels in areas that need more oxygen, more nutrients, and we're going to close off areas that need less oxygen and less nutrients just by design. Okay, so autoregulation is defined as automatic adjustment of blood flow to each tissue relative to its varying requirements. Right? Again, if I require more oxygen and nutrients, then more blood goes to that area. It's controlled intrinsically by modifying the diameter of local arterioles feeding the capillaries. Again, these arterioles are sort of your muscular arteries, right? They have lots of smooth muscle and can dilate and constrict or open up and close depending on the needs of that tissue. So we have two types of autoregulation. We have metabolic controls and myogenic controls. Both of them are always active, and both of them will determine the final amount of flow or the final autoregulatory response. The metabolic controls are pretty simple, right? Again, the concept is autoregulation, meaning I open up where I need more nutrients, where I need more oxygen, and I close off where I need less nutrients, where I need less oxygen. So the metabolic controls are vasodilation of arterioles and relaxation of precapillary sphincters, again, opening up those true capillaries in response to declining tissue oxygen. Right? If I start to use a particular muscle more, I'm going to be using up the oxygen in that area, and therefore those arteries dilate and my precapillary sphincters open, right? My capillary beds open, and now blood is flowing through my true capillaries as well. So again, one of the main factors influencing this is declining tissue oxygen. The other, buildup of waste, right? If I have a buildup of substances from metabolically active tissues, I'm also going to cause this to happen. I'm going to open up my arterioles, open up my capillary beds. Okay. So, thirdly, we have hormones which affect this, okay? Endocrine molecules which affect our metabolic controls. And here we're talking about these effects causing the relaxation of vascular smooth muscle or the release of nitric oxide, right? The release of nitric oxide is going to cause the relaxation of vascular smooth muscle. Okay, so we have endothelins which are released from the endothelial lining of these blood vessels. These are potent vasoconstrictors, and nitric oxide and endothelians are usually battling for control of, this opening or closing. Okay, so nitric oxide and endothelians again are battling sort of for control of whether this blood vessel is open or closed. But when I have low blood flow, this means that I have low removal of nitric oxide, right? Nitric oxide is going to be continually released by these endothelial cells and therefore is not taken away by my blood flow. Therefore, when I have low blood flow, this nitric oxide will win and basically cause vasodilation as opposed to vasoconstriction. So this is really the main metabolic mechanism, right? Where I have the buildup of nitric oxide because I don't have a lot of blood flow, it's the same thing as sort of having the buildup of waste, right? The buildup of metabolically active products. Okay, so here you can see this metabolic control is fairly similar. Okay. Finally, the myogenic control. Okay, the myogenic control is going to be responsible for keeping tissue perfusion relatively constant. Okay, so as you go from systolic pressure to diastolic pressure, or vice versa. This myogenic response is going to keep pressure somewhat constant. Okay, so it's really going to reverse any effect of pressure. Okay, so what happens? This vascular smooth muscle doesn't just have nervous controls, but it also inherently responds to stretch. Right, where I have passive stretch because I have increased pressure, my vascular smooth muscle is going to constrict. Okay, where I have reduced stretch because I have less blood pressure, my blood vessel is going to relax. Okay. So again, the myogenic control is really just sort of opposing any pressure, and you can see back here. This is controls, both metabolic and myogenic. Any questions with this stuff? Okay. We also have long-term autoregulation. This long-term autoregulation is very rare, right? It usually only occurs when short-term regulation is not going to do its job. Okay. So with long-term autoregulation, the only thing we can do is grow new blood vessels. Okay, this is a process known as angiogenesis. And really what happens is you release a bunch of hormones, and those hormones basically tell this region to increase the number of blood vessels which feed it. Okay. Not only does it increase the number of blood vessels which feed that region, but it also enlarges existing blood vessels. All right. So how does blood flow to each of these different areas change with activity? Okay, so blood flow to the skeletal muscles is fairly obvious, right? When I have increased muscle activity, whether this is just because you're exercising or whatever it might be, right? Increased muscle activity causes increased blood flow to those areas. Again, via metabolic controls, right? Blood flow is going to increase in direct proportion to the metabolic activity. The more oxygen I'm using, the more waste I produce, the more blood flow is going to come to this area. Blood flow to the brain, relatively simple. It does not change, right? Blood flow to the brain is constant because neurons are very sensitive. There's really not a time where you don't want blood to be bathing the neurons, right? Okay, so the average is 750 milliliters per minute, and it really doesn't change, right? Blood flow to the skin, like I said before, is important in thermoregulation. Okay, again, it sort of happens via these metabolic controls, right? The more oxygen I'm using, the more blood flow I get to the tissues. But this is going to be directly related to my body temperature, right? So when I have more or a higher body temperature because I'm exercising, I usually shunt blood out to the skin, again, to release some of that heat. Okay. Furthermore, all this blood stored in my skin can act as a blood reservoir. Okay, sort of have all of this blood here in the skin, which isn't really doing much. If I ever need blood in other places, what I'll do is I'll take blood away from the skin and move it back to more important parts. Okay, so temperature regulation, right? We already went over this. As temperature rises, we basically have these blood vessels opening, warm blood flushes to the capillary beds, and we can lose some of that heat from the skin. Just the opposite happens as temperature decreases, right? As temperature decreases, we move blood away from the skin into deeper organs, so we save that heat, right? Sort of out in the cold. Has anybody noticed this? Well, it's never cold in Florida, but if you've ever moved to somewhere that's cold, you sort of blood leaves your skin, sort of leaves,
Yeah, you get lighter.
Most superficial areas like your ears, your nose, right?
Bradykinin stimulates what is it?
So also when you're hot and you're sweating, you release bradykinin, and bradykinin causes vasodilation, or basically it influences the metabolic controls by releasing nitric oxide and causes vasodilation. But I didn't mention that because I'm not going to put it on your exam. Yes?
Why is it that anemic patients tend to be colder? I know because their anemia is low, but why is it the reason?
Why do anemic patients tend to be colder? I would imagine it would depend on their type of anemia, right? Like why they have anemia. If they have anemia due to low blood volume, then the answer is obvious, right? They have less blood holding in heat, okay? And therefore, wherever their entire blood volume is lower, therefore, the blood that's going to the skin is in higher proportion than normal, right? So the percentage of heat loss would be higher than normal. If you have like iron deficient anemia, I can't imagine that your body temperature would be lower. I'd imagine it'd be higher, right? Because you're trying to produce more blood, and you do produce more blood, but So your blood volume would be up, but you just can't pull in the oxygen. So I don't know. Is what
Could
I'm
it
saying.
also be too that,
Amelia, whatever that was. And, I don't know that much, but I'm always told that
I don't know the answer to that question. Sorry.
I was gonna say, could it be also too that because of the fact that, the body is trying to keep that blood and that heat to the internal organs more, so the peripheral,
Feels colder.
right, feels colder,
Sure,
the
yeah,
skin and
that's-
everything, yeah.
That's probably a better answer.
like, yeah, like that.
Yeah, so what she's basically saying is you have less oxygen carriers, and therefore you're not going to waste those oxygen carriers on the skin. You shun it deeper, and therefore the outside of your body might feel a little bit
To
colder.
your vital organs.
Yeah. Good answer. This is critical thinking at its finest. Okay. So let's finish this up real quickly. Blood flow to the lungs. Here, everything's reversed. Okay, so the pulmonary circuit is unusual in that where you have low oxygen, you don't want increased blood flow, but you want decreased blood flow. Where you have high oxygen, you don't want decreased blood flow, you want increased blood flow. Why would that be? Right, when we compare it to the systemic circuit and the skeletal muscles, where when I'm using my muscle, right, I'm using up the oxygen, and therefore I want more blood flow to that area.
To get more oxygen.
To get more oxygen. When I'm talking about the pulmonary circuit, right, the blood flow to the lungs, where I have less oxygen, I end up with less blood flow. Why is that?
Because you're getting the carbon.
Okay, so here we're talking about, in the systemic circuit, your arteries are carrying oxygenated blood, right? Blood with oxygen to unoxygenated areas, right? So when I use my muscles and I have less oxygen, I increase my oxygenated blood flow. In the pulmonary circuit, it's the opposite. We're carrying deoxygenated blood in our arteries. Okay, so wherever I have less oxygen, I'm not going to bring this deoxygenated blood to. I'm not going to bring any blood there, right? Where I have more oxygen is where I'm going to bring this deoxygenated blood to. Okay, so it's important to know that the metabolic or myogenic controls, well, the metabolic controls are the complete opposite in the lungs as they are in the skeletal muscle. Okay, so again, an autoregulatory mechanism opposite that in most tissues. Low oxygen levels cause vasoconstriction, high levels promote vasodilation. And again, that's because systemic circuit, you're carrying oxygenated blood, pulmonary circuit, you're carrying deoxygenated blood. Okay, blood flow to the heart. Unfortunately, the heart can only get blood during relaxation, right? During ventricular systole, the pressure goes up, the myocardium constricts, and all those coronary vessels are actually compressed. Okay, so blood's only delivered to the heart during relaxation, and at rest, it's about 250 milliliters per minute. Now, it's sort of the same as skeletal muscle, where strenuous exercise is obviously going to increase the heart rate, increase the amount of oxygen you're using, and therefore increase flow. Okay. Again, coronary vessels will dilate in response to local accumulation of vasodilators. And therefore, blood flow may increase to the heart 3 to 4 times. 250 to 750 is what we saw. Okay, finally, blood flow through the capillaries. This is something we'll get into next class period. It's a very important concept. Again, we're talking about the capillaries as the place of exchange or the site of exchange. So we want to know what happens to blood as we move through the capillaries from the arterial end to the venous end. Does anybody have any questions about this stuff that we went over today? I realize your exam